So I will now call the roll, and please say here when your name is called. Commissioner Boland?
Here.
Commissioner Fell?
Here.
Commissioner Fern?
Here.
Commissioner Gordon?
Here.
Commissioner Hull?
Here.
Commissioner Kleinman?
Here.
Commissioner Nahidi?
Here.
Commissioner Parsons?
Here.
Commissioner Sims?
Here.
Commissioner Trudeau?
Here.
Commissioner Dolan?
Here.
Sergeant Bill Clapp?
Here.
Excellent timing. Commissioner Margolis? Commissioner Webb? And Raymond Hess as the alternate, filling the role of Commissioner Luke Liu and Commissioner Eli Cooper.
Here.
We have a quorum.
All right. I'm got a little issues here with my computer, but so we need to approve the agenda unless there's any additions or corrections. I'll take a motion to approve. So moved. All right, seconded by, okay, you got that, Kayla?
If
All
you
in-
could just repeat who was the motion, Boland and
Trudeau.
Thank you.
All in favor? Say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? All right, we have an agenda. And with that, we will have the public commentary. And so speakers get 3 minutes apiece. So if you sign in, and Kayla will keep track of that. Thanks.
Hi, folks. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
So I'm Victoria Green of 803 Sycamore Place. Thank you for listening to me this evening. I came to talk about scooters, which are on your agenda this evening. And I'm glad you guys are talking about it. I think there are substantial issues, especially with the rapid deployment and use of our public sidewalks for storage, and that there are issues to discuss that the city should be involved in. So thank you for taking the matter up. But I really came today not to talk about that, but instead to talk about a totally different use case for scooters themselves. I should be upfront, my family owns one of these, so I'm not so interested in sort of the bird scooter model. I'm sure you're going to hear and talk a lot about that, but I have no particular expertise or perspective on that. So what I see is that since the bird scooters were deployed in Ann Arbor's come down really hard on prohibiting them as transportation. We're saying, it's my understanding, no use. You can't use them on sidewalks, you can't use them on bike lanes, and you can't use them on scooters. I'm sure that some of that, sidewalks. Can't use them on sidewalks, streets. I'm sure some of that is because we were caught unawares and needed to move quickly with a really rapid adoption model. But the thing that I wanted everyone to be sure you were thinking about was the use of them as viable transportation options, especially outside of the densest downtown core. I also think that there is a law that's going to come into effect next week about electric skateboards, which is going to change Ann Arbor's ability to enforce their existing prohibition. Again, that isn't really what I want to talk about. I want to talk about using scooters to get along places like Stadium and Scioto Church Road and parts where people have to go where there aren't a lot of people on the sidewalk, that are short distances, where people today are driving their cars. We say we want multimodal transport. Can we include scooters in that? Or do we have to prohibit them? Okay, and of course, now I've lost my phone, so what else did I want to say? So in contrast to Ann Arbor, Detroit's taken a really different approach, right? They say that the primary usage of scooters should be in the roadways and bike lanes, but that it is permissible to use them on sidewalks where it represents a low likelihood of disturbance to pedestrians. I don't think that's Main Street on a Friday night. I think there's a high likelihood of disturbance to pedestrians. But Scioto Church Road, that sidewalk, wide open. Stadium sidewalk in front of Ann Arbor High School, wide open. So I have a kid who is legally allowed to ride an e-bike to the Ice Cube. She's got to go there a million times per week. Before we bought a scooter, drove her 12 miles round trip in a minivan. Because yes, I've ridden my bike there. Yes, she's taken the bus there. The scooter was a great option for getting her there. And I'd love for her to safely be able to continue to do that. Thank you all.
Is there anyone else who'd like to speak?
Hi, good evening. My name is Clark Chernesky. I live at 2646 Straver Boulevard. There are two quick items I'd like to mention. They're both in the update that you received today on transportation projects. One has to do with the Blewett traffic calming study that was done that did not get enough support by the residents living along Blewett to become reality. However, I think that an increase in pedestrian and crossing safety can be done by repainting, or in some cases painting, the crosswalks on that corridor. As I walked in detail when you're out looking at it in the field study, and I drive it about once or twice a week, and I think that that's something that should be done. There also may be some portions of that project that the city could perhaps construct without having to be part of the whole corridor, but perhaps they should be looked at. The other thing had to do with the Nixon Road study that's being done, and it was given as a reason to delay putting in a sidewalk on the west side of Nixon Road between Traver and DuVerin, where the new housing development is going in there. I'd urge you to do what you can to put a sidewalk in there, even if it's an asphalt one, to be considered temporary, because there'd be a lot of people living there shortly. I think people are starting to move in now. And perhaps the engineering that's being done on the Nixon Road corridor is sufficient to be able to say, this is where we could put a sidewalk. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Who else would like to speak? All right, and public commentary is closed. Thank you very much. And we have minutes to approve. Are there any additions or corrections to the minutes? All right, then I'll take a motion to approve. Okay, seconded by? All right. All those in favor? Aye?
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? All right, we have minutes then. So we have information discussion, and we're just going to start with connected transportation. Thanks for coming.
Sure.
We've been waiting for this for months.
Yeah, I apologize. I
understand.
woke up at about 1 o'clock that morning that I was supposed to be here with 103-degree temperature. So
It's a very
it
good
was probably
excuse.
better that I didn't come. So my name is Jim Sayre. I'm the director of the University of Michigan's Transportation Research Institute. I've been before this board before to give an update on connected vehicle technology. Excuse me. And so here I am again. That was at least 2 years ago, I believe, that I was here last time. So just quickly, some background information. You know, we started in actually talking to the city in 2011 on a project called Safety Pilot Model Deployment. That project wrapped up and was launched in terms of the technology in 2012, and then converted over in 2015 to essentially same project, different name. This was the U.S. Department of Transportation's decision to change the name, not ours. They only made it more convoluted, but they did manage to squeeze Ann Arbor in there, so that was a positive. Overall, since 2011, we've invested almost $50 million in the community. Not all of that has been in hardware or infrastructure. Actually, only a small percentage of that is. But we spent a lot of money on recruiting drivers that live or work or live and work in the community to have their vehicles equipped with wireless technology. So this wireless technology communicates with other vehicles that have the technology, and it communicates with the infrastructure, so the traffic signals. What this allows us to do is if you have two vehicles that are approaching one another, they're on a collision path, this one's saying, I'm here, now I'm here, now I'm here, and you can anticipate, based upon the trajectories, whether or not they're going to collide and warn the driver. On the infrastructure side, what you can do is you can broadcast out what is the signal phase and timing. So what is the light green, yellow, or red? How much longer is it going to be that? Or is it about to turn red and it's about to turn green? And I'll talk about a project a little bit later that we'll be launching on Plymouth Road that uses that. But you can essentially more effectively manage the traffic along those corridors if people know in advance what the signal phase is and when it's about to change. So a lot of money. We have helped with some fiber throughout the community, not a lot. Mostly the equipment has been the wireless radios installed in the infrastructure and in people's individual cars. We hit a lull recently because there were new standards that were adopted by the federal government for the communications equipment, and manufacturers were very slow to meet those standards. So we were down to about 1,500 vehicles. We're now on our way back up to getting about 20, I think we're going to go for 2,650. So it's still the largest deployment of this technology of its kind anywhere in the world. And there's some other areas we're going to expand in. So I mentioned the new standards that were adopted in 2016, but really manufacturers are only now producing radios that meet those. We are currently at 22 locations, infrastructure locations, where we have these wireless radios. Plymouth, Washtenaw, Fuller have them. Depot has them. We are, though, working with the city. Luke, Craig, and others have identified a variety of other locations where we can install these. And so we'll be adding those radios yet this year. In fact, we're just validating them now. So eventually there will be 70 locations around the community that have these radios that are capable of broadcasting out the information. One of the other really potentially positive things from a mobility perspective that these radios can do is we've equipped virtually every single bus that operates in this community. So all university buses, all AAATA buses, and the majority of Ann Arbor Public School buses. By broadcasting a signal, these buses can communicate to the infrastructure and say, I'm a transit vehicle, and I'm coming up to the signal. If you could just wait an extra couple seconds before you turn yellow, this transit vehicle then can get through, and you can help reduce transit times and then improve, acceptance on the part of the ridership. So we'll be demonstrating that as well in a few locations. But we picked a wide range of different types of locations. We've got roundabouts, curves, 4 pedestrian crosswalks that we're working on. These are mid-block crosswalks. These are along Plymouth Road. These are prototype systems. Specifically, what we're doing is we're using other types of sensing technology, cameras and radar, to detect the presence of a person in the crosswalk. And then the radio is broadcasting out a warning to those vehicles that have the equipment in them that there's actually a pedestrian in the crosswalk. One of the challenges we have, particularly on Plymouth Road, is those, the crosswalks are timed to allow older people like myself to get across, but the students, stream across them, particularly if they're riding on a bike, and the light keeps flashing. The question is, there's nobody there. So even I find myself quite often scanning more often further than I would normally, trying to make sure that nobody's there because the light's still going. Eventually, this kind of technology could actually eliminate the need for actually pressing the button. It would automatically detect the presence of the pedestrian as they approach the crosswalk and anytime anybody was in the crosswalk. We're not there yet, but these are the kinds of technologies that we're experimenting with. We have what says additional applications. So I mentioned you can warn vehicles to avoid colliding. There is, I'm going to skip ahead a couple. These are the applications. So we have, as I just mentioned, pedestrian and crosswalk, the forward collision warning, which I mentioned, electronic emergency brake light. So this is a situation where maybe 2 or 3 or 5 cars ahead of you, you can't even see the car that slams on the brakes, but it can broadcast a signal that it's rapidly decelerating, and you, being further back in the stream, can be warned in advance. You don't have to wait for the brake lights of the truck that's in front of you to come on. Red light violation warning, so this is warning the actual driver of a vehicle that as they approach an intersection, that a vehicle is violating a red light and try to get you to avoid entering. Emergency vehicle approach. So for those of us in the hot summer who have the air conditioning on and the radio going, can't always quite hear the emergency vehicles approaching as far away as we would like to, we can present warnings inside the vehicle to the driver. So these are just some of the different examples of the kinds of applications once we have the infrastructure and the vehicles equipped that we can actually execute. Oops. Can I use the arrow? All right, hold on a second. Here we go. All right, there are different flavors of these devices. The roadside equipment are the radios that I talked about that are hanging in the infrastructure that'll be in 70 locations in the city. We have the plain vanilla flavor is a vehicle awareness device. That driver's not getting any warnings, but they are out there populating the environment, so the people that have the other device, aftermarket safety devices, that vehicle, the vehicle awareness device slammed on the brakes 5 vehicles up, the person with the display in it would get a warning. There's a big cost differential. We'd like all of those vehicles to be aftermarket safety devices, but right now there's a big cost differential, and so we're roughly going to be split 50-50. I won't go into this in detail other than to say it's for those drivers that are getting warnings, it's a very simple interface. There is a speaker located under the dash, and there is a small LED display mounted between the crux of the windshield, the base of the windshield, and the dashboard. So we've been collecting data now contiguously since 2012, a lot of origin destination data. A lot of data has been used to model the traffic flow on various streets in and around the city. Also, data has been used for optimizing timing of traffic signals. Just by having the data, knowing how long vehicles are waiting, and what kinds of maneuvers they're making in any given intersection, you can optimize the timing. And so there is one study, in fact, based upon data that was collected here in Ann Arbor, there are 10,000 intersections around China that are being updated to maximize traffic flow in those communities. A company called Didi, which is kind of the Uber or Lyft equivalent in China, is paying a university faculty member to deploy those things because if they save time, they can make more money. So here's the kind of the crux of this thing. If we can maximize throughput and save people time, and hopefully prevent crashes, we've met our objective. Not going to go into too much detail in this other than to say some of the data we're getting will be in real time, so city traffic planners will be able to utilize that to know just how congested parts of the city streets are. Yeah. And then we've got all that signal detection data. So just knowing how long people are waiting at any given intersection. There's a number of other projects that are ongoing that are related to the connected vehicle technology that basically leverage that. AIMS, the Ann Arbor Integrated Mobility System, this was a proposal we submitted about 2 months ago with Ford Motor Company and the city to expand on the connected vehicle technology and actually deploy more of the transit signal prioritization for AAATA and university buses. We don't know if we won that yet. We'll know next month. Other projects, one we're working with Ford in the city, alleyway management. So congestion in the alleyway associated with delivery trucks, when the garbage truck or the recycling truck or other vehicles need to get through the alleyway. So how can you communicate and detect that alley's full and hopefully clear it? I mentioned the dynamic traffic control. That's what's being deployed in China, and we'll be deploying that at, I think, 5 intersections along Plymouth Road from 23 inbound. Pedestrian detection, I mentioned that. We're starting with 4 mid-block crossings on Plymouth Road. We're looking to expand that to 19 mid-block crossings across the city. And lastly, working with a consortium of automotive manufacturers, there is what's called Eco Approach and Departure. By broadcasting the signal, information about when the signal is going to change, you can instruct the driver. You look down the road, the light might be red, but don't start slowing down now, because if the coast is clear between you and signal, don't apply the brakes, because by the time you get there, it'll be green. Likewise, if you see lights green, but you're not going to get through that intersection based upon the speed at which you're traveling, it can tell you, just take your foot off the gas now and coast to the intersection. So reduced emissions, reduced fuel consumption. And so again, a consortium of manufacturers want to test that from Ford Road. Well, I'm trying to convince them Ford Road. They're committed to Dixboro Road all the way in to Barton. So happy to answer questions if you have any. It's a lot to kind of digest.
How does Michigan's development of 5G service play into your efforts?
So the technology that we're using is called dedicated short-range communication. It has already been approved by the FCC. Was set, part of the spectrum was set aside about 15 years ago. It's been under development for over 12 years. If you want to go with 5G, I'm not suggesting that nobody should use 5G, but there's a long development cycle that needs to take place in order to get to the point that we are at currently with dedicated short-range communication. I believe ultimately it'll be a combination of dedicated short-range communication and cellular, probably 5G. The reason being, as we move towards automated vehicle or autonomous vehicles, no manufacturer is putting all their eggs in one basket in terms of their detection capability. No one's relying exclusively on a LiDAR. They're using a LiDAR, they're using image processing, radar. The same will be true with the wireless signals. They're going to want at least 2 modes of wireless communication between themselves and other vehicles and the infrastructure in case there's a failure or in one of them. So it's not an if or an or, or this or that. I think eventually they're both going to be required. Realize, though, that there's a much bigger equipment commitment for 5G. You need every half a mile you need to install radios in the infrastructure. It's far less than that with the dedicated short-range communication, unless you're trying to control individual traffic signals. Then you need them more frequently. Other questions?
Well, I have one. The last time you were here, one of the things you talked about in my memory was giving out smartphones to users, pedestrians, that would then communicate with cars. And so I'm wondering about what happened with that project, but also in general, if this is focusing on the cars giving and receiving information, or if there is more involvement or plans to look into pedestrians, bicycles, maybe even scooters?
There are. We're going to use either cellular or Wi-Fi. Originally, we were going to repurpose the chip in the phone to broadcast at the DSRC frequency. I'm trying to figure out how to say this politely. There's a company that manufactures chips that doesn't have any patents on DSRC, but they make a lot of chips for phones. They make the preponderance of chips for phones. And so they decided after we started working with them that they weren't going to make any that were DSRC, because they make $3 on a DSRC's chip and $30 on a cellular chip. So we had to scrap that initial approach, and now we're trying to get restarted using cellular and Wi-Fi.
But in general,
Yeah,
you're
we're
also
still doing
looking
it.
into that.
Yeah, there's a whole number of pedestrian and bicyclist-related studies we're working on that I haven't even talked about.
Okay.
So.
This, related to that question, you mentioned the aftermarket for the sort of advanced version and the cost differential involved. If you could speak a little bit about that cost differential in light of Linda Diane's question, our most vulnerable users tend to be those who also have some income disparity issues. This is, the people that can afford it might be safer on the roads, whereas there might be some disparity between users.
Yeah. Well, the one good news about this is that these devices can be retrofitted to any vehicle. So you don't have to purchase a new vehicle in order to get this device. The vehicle awareness device, which would still, in theory, protect you from being struck by a vehicle that had the warnings in it, probably will end up retailing for about $200, not including installation. It's not clear. It'll probably have to be installed at a dealership, and it has to do with security of the wireless device. So you're probably looking maybe $300 installed. And you can transfer that from that vehicle to another vehicle when you switch vehicles. So it doesn't have to stay with the vehicle. When you start talking about the warning device, manufacturers are really sensitive about the look and the feel of the interior of their cars. And so they want to provide, as nice of a display as possible. Manufacturers currently are, like vibrating seats. They might, Tesla has a 12-inch touchscreen in the center console. So, it depends on the individual manufacturer. They will all integrate it differently, but they're going to want, for whatever the market segment is of their vehicle, they're going to want to give the best presentation, best look and feel they can. And that's what's going to drive the price. It's not the radio itself. It's the manner in which it's integrated and just how fancy they want to get.
And the timing for that?
Well, last time I was here, I thought it was right around the corner. With the change in administration in Washington and a desire to back away from regulations, there's a regulation sitting on the desk of the Secretary of Transportation. It's been sitting there for 2 years. Keep hoping one day she's going to pick it up and she's going to sign it, but it hasn't happened yet. In the meantime, we are killing thousands of people.
Okay.
I had a question.
Sure.
So, for the people who are participating in the study, you're collecting all of the data to use. When these devices are deployed in the market, how is that data? Is that data being collected or stored? And if
No,
so,
it is not. It's completely de-identified, and there's a very sophisticated process that goes into actually the security perspective, both from protecting the privacy of the operator, but also to make sure that it can't get hacked. This is a research study, and so we need to know if, because these are all prototype systems, effectively, or at least they're some of the first ones off the assembly lines, we need to know if one fails. And so we monitor. If we don't hear one of the radios for a couple of weeks, then we know who to contact to find out, did the radio fail? Are they on vacation? If they just had the flu and so they haven't been driving, or if the weather's nice and they decided to use their bike. But yeah, and then we use, obviously, and one of your colleagues at the Ford School, Robert Hampshire, uses a lot of this data as well to understand mobility.
Any other questions, comments?
Back to the 5G question, there are currently no portable 5G devices available. So, I mean, they were a number of years away.
I'm skeptical our Michigan legislature is going to pass 5G legislation anytime soon, too.
Yeah.
So I hope that you'll be in touch with us as
More
other
frequently?
exciting developments happen.
Okay. Yeah.
Because I think it's important to be aware of what's going on.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. All right. I believe our next item is to talk about scooters. Scott had the foresight to suggest this as an agenda item more than a month ago. So I appreciate that you were paying attention to the future as well.
What did Scott know at the time?
Yeah, I found the Scooters Have Arrived, Don't Panic article that you sent me just about a month ago was very
Well, he's
interesting
paying
timing
attention.
coming out this time.
Yeah. And so it became even more timely to put that on the agenda. And I think we want to sort of get all on the same page about this, but also with the focus of, do we need to create a task force? Do we need to make recommendations to city council? And my sense of the commission is that we want to be welcoming of devices which are, which expand the choices that people have for transportation. And so we may also have some response to the city response, which was fairly short and threatening, I would say. So Raymond, I believe, has agreed to give us a little bit of legal background, and Scott has some information about the topic in general, sort of what's happening around the country and actually internationally. So we just want to have sort of a free-range discussion, and with the possibility at the end that I'll ask for some suggestions for what would be the most productive and effective way for us to move forward. Do you want to start with some of the legal stuff, Scott, or do you want to go ahead? So,
Yeah, I think I'd be interested in first just
Raymond.
hearing sort of the city, since we had this bird show up, what the city's response has been, how the city's approaching it, and what the city's plans are.
And what the actual legal
Right.
requirements are.
I had an email that I have promptly lost since I was going to reference it, of
Okay.
course. But actually, one of our speakers earlier today kind of referenced it as well. So our understanding is that there's a existing legislation that will take effect on September 18th that regulates electric skateboards and expressly allows for their use in the street. The current interpretation is that while it doesn't expressly call out e-scooters per se, it seems to be that that's the most kind of consistent with the intent of what that's trying to regulate. For those of you that have seen kind of these electrics or electronic skateboards, it's kind of a similar device just without the handles, right? It may have a remote control, probably goes similar speeds. And so I think the understanding or the thought behind it is that from our perspective right now, that that law would kind of regulate scooters as well. Now, there might be others, legislature included, that might feel differently about it, but that's kind of right now where we stand on the situation. So this coming week is kind of a weird little gray area in terms of are they allowed or are they not allowed, and how would they be regulated? You know, we know these things have existed, especially on the private sector, you know, and just like individuals who've had these, you know, they're not necessarily a new thing. I think the big difference is really that you now have a mass deployment of these in the public right of way that was not anticipated, was not, you know, regulated, permitted, any of the above. And so it was really a question from, you know, the city's perspective in terms of, okay, well, how do we look at that from that perspective? And so that's a whole nother discussion that I think those discussions are still ongoing. I don't have a really good answer in terms of what that will look like moving forward. But there are some, you know, we want to think carefully through kind of both sides of the equation, because I think, you know, the interest in allowing for mobility, I think, is something that the city shares from a city staff perspective. But then at the same time, we're also mindful towards use of the public right of way, whether that's street or whether it's sidewalk, making sure that, you know, we're using the space so that we're not actually, you know, blocking passageways or what have you. And then, you know, just the safety, obviously, of all the users, whether that be the scooter users, whether that be pedestrians on the sidewalk, if that's where scooters end up lawfully or unlawfully. And then if they're in the roadway as well, you know, what does that interaction look like? And so I think those are some of the issues that we're trying to kind of think through right now. You know, I think the legality question is going to kind of work itself out, especially come next week. But I think some of those other issues in terms of the actual permitting of the business within the right-of-way is kind of a separate issue that we're thinking through right now. So, so I don't have a lot of really great answers for you. I mean, as you know, this issue is less than a week old for us, so we're kind of responding as quickly as we can. We are looking to other communities in terms of what they've gone into their considerations. We've looked at Detroit's response. We have kind of their policy statement, and I've been in contact with their chief mobility officer or I think director of innovation and mobility. So we've been in discussions with other communities. We're looking at some of those regulations from other places and trying to kind of figure out what are some of the considerations that we should be looking at when we move forward, so that we're kind of smart on the issue and getting educated on it. So ultimately, what I think we were pretty excited about this conversation today, just to see what kind of concerns and issues are raised by this commission that we can enter into that conversation internally. We are also planning to meet with some of our public partners as well, that being, you know, the university, the Downtown Development Authority, the RIDE, the bus system. And so we're again trying to just kind of make sure we're coming about this as holistically as possible.
Okay. Scott, you take a few minutes to.
All right, I could I could go on. I'll try to keep it brief. I just wanted to highlight a couple of terms. So as we start talking about this, the terms I keep seeing come up are micromobility and shared active transportation, which comes from NACDO, related to sort of all of these different platforms, because they're not just scooters, but there are dockless bikes, there are dockless e-bikes, and the old Arbor bike system, I think, would fall under that. Some of the advocates and people working in policy on this have been careful to note that, to the extent possible, at least at the city level, obviously the state has identified electric skateboards as a specific thing, but at the city level to kind of keep our minds open about what the forms these things are going to take are, because we don't really know. So in terms of regulating, like, try not to be overly specific on the mode, since we might see a lot of systems that work similarly that aren't exactly the same. And I'll just share a few things I discovered as I was doing some research on this. Why is this happening now? I didn't have any special insider information about Bird coming, but it was anybody. I've been following this for a while, and when they showed up in Detroit, it was pretty obvious that with the semester starting, that it was likely they were going to show up, and it was even sooner than I expected. But I was curious as to why now and why this form. Given that Arbor Bike went away because we couldn't afford to subsidize it or find a partner that would help operate it. And maybe that'll come back, and we're still waiting to hear an update on that. These dockless systems that don't require the infrastructure installed docks and the vehicles themselves are much cheaper. And if you believe what some of the companies are saying, they already are operating at a profit, which isn't even true of Uber or Lyft. Which I don't know if that's true or not, but that's what they're saying. But in terms, and up to, and I have some links here though, that I'm happy to share by Kayla with everybody if there's interest. But even pay off within a month in some places potentially. And that might just be them fluffing up the numbers for their investors, but the scooters, these scooters are about $500 a piece. And where, I don't know what the current numbers are, but a couple of years ago, docked bikes were almost $2,000 a piece. So, and they're more flexible. So that was, I thought, interesting. I just want to acknowledge, I think the two biggest dangers or the two biggest problems are really the danger of crashes. We want these things to be operated safely as they're interacting with the street, and the blocking of sidewalks, especially for accessibility. So I look forward to looking at how we can regulate these things to prevent those problems without making them go away. And I wanted to highlight the fact that we have climate and sustainability goals and a Vision Zero goals, and wanted to encourage us all to see this as an opportunity to serve those goals by helping do mode shift. And use any regulation we do approach to make these systems work better for the users and not just try to clamp down on it. Thank you for answering my questions. I had some staff questions that I think you hit on. I did notice that the city's been confiscating some. They're showing up on the map at the city facility off of Stone School in Ellsworth, which I thought was amusing. Which I'm assuming is can you speak to what's going on there? I'm just curious.
So we had notified Bird that for scooters that are the most egregious in terms of where they were left, whether that's blocking a sidewalk or posing some sort of safety concern, we would document that and confiscate or impound them.
Sure, yeah, that seems reasonable, but I thought that was amusing to actually see them move on the map. We're like, why is there a cluster of them at Stone School Road? I don't really know. Yeah. Fascinating, and it's fun to be able to see that. All right, so a couple of other things. I thought that a lot of cities are wrestling with this now, and we're kind of late to the game. And I thought it was interesting to note that some of the regulatory approaches cities are taking. So Portland, Oregon has proposed a tax. I don't know if that's in place, where they're actually taxing. One article I saw said like $1 per scooter per day or something like that. Another one I saw said $0.25 a trip. I'm not sure which is true or if any has passed, but I know they've been the first ones looking at a tax with the intent of directing that revenue into a mobility fund to fund staff to manage these programs and to potentially invest in infrastructure improvements to help make the systems work better, which I think is a great idea to look into. And one article I read did some back of the envelope math with a sort of pessimistic assumption of usage and taxes, and we're projecting over $1 million in revenue for the city of Portland. Now, we're not quite the same size, but it's could potentially provide some reasonable revenue to help offset the hassles that we have to put up with as a city to deal with it. They're also starting with a cap on the total number of vehicles, which I'm not a huge fan of, but I think it's an interesting way to start off conservatively, just to kind of keep it from going crazy, especially if we're not going to be requiring exclusive provider contracts or limiting the number of providers, which is also an option and one I'm not a fan of, but some cities are investigating. A number of cities are instituting rebalancing requirements, like requiring them to balance the network periodically, sometimes including equity requirements, so looking at parts of the city that are underserved and making sure that they're serving the entire population of the city and not just the wealthiest corners. There's some interesting work, I don't think anybody's doing this yet, but some interesting work out of Los Angeles where there's a published draft for a API, an application programming interface that all of the providers operating would be required to support, which would give the city detailed insight into real-time operation of each provider's network and like detailed status on individual trips, individual vehicles, give the cities the ability to geofence operations, so the cities could actually regulate where scooters could and could not be operated, and have the scooters turn off if you take them out of the permitted zones, and or enforce speed limits that are different per zone. So speed limits are another thing. These things with the electric throttle devices can have speed limits be regulated as well. So there's a lot of interesting work going on here to try to kind of figure out how to manage this. So I just wanted to highlight those. I thought those were particularly interesting. And then just lastly, on the note of sort of working to make these systems better, I'm hoping we see this as an opportunity to look at how we're organizing the space on our streets for all users. I think a lot of the problems that these things sort of potentially generate are all problems we're already trying to solve in terms of like, where do we park bikes and where do we operate our bikes or other vehicles in the roads. And so if we're going to be trying to influence behavior, which I think we should, to have these not be operated on crowded sidewalks and have them be parked appropriately, we should be looking at how can we create more protected bike lanes. As the Portland was a bicycle director or whatever said something like where's my quote? Someone biking on the sidewalk is only trying to ride in the protected bike lane that isn't there. So I think that's also true of scooter riders. If we're going to ask them to go on the streets as downtown, which I think we should, and that's maybe a question we should have as a commission beyond just these, is should we be looking at more detailed regulation about how we expect people to ride and where. I think outside of downtown, as the public speaker made a good point, the sidewalks are often appropriate. I start and end my day on my bike on a sidewalk because I live on North Main Street where it's 4 lanes and it's terrifying. And I get on the street as soon as I can. But like looking at how can we make the infrastructure encourage people to act how we want instead of just trying to demand it. And similarly with parking, like making sure we have places to put these things. And then my last question is just, and this is sort of to commission, are we at a point where we want to make a recommendation to council or to staff, or do we just want to have this conversation? I'm also curious what other people are thinking or worried about, or if there's anything I missed. Oh, sorry, I hope that wasn't too long.
So I'd like to hear from other people, including what you think is an appropriate action to take at the,
I could chime in a little bit. So of course this came through special services, which we handle all the traffic stuff, and quite surprising to me, like sounds like to some others as well. But so did a little research on our bike lane ordinance, and vehicles cannot be driven in a bike lane. So these are defined by the vehicle code as a vehicle. So I would avoid that unless there's a change to the ordinance. And then also sidewalks, if it is motorized, it can't be ridden on the sidewalk. So Whatever route the commission takes and the council takes, those have to be considered, those two things.
Is that in the city ordinances?
The bicycle lane part is.
Okay.
The statute that takes effect next week talks about referencing the electric skateboard by local ordinance and may be required to use the bicycle path. So that would be something that the council could amend, and that could be worked out.
Okay.
So there must be a provision for, I mean, the state passed a law last October about e-bikes and put them in different classifications and gave some e-bikes the full rights of bikes, but not other types of e-bikes, having to do with throttle and things like that. So some motorized vehicles are allowed, but some are not, it sounds like.
That could be. I haven't researched that part of it. I just looked up the electric skateboards was the only definition we could really find that kind of fit this device, from what I was told last
Yeah.
week when the emails started flowing.
I have a Class 2 e-bike, which is supposed to be allowed most places, but not everywhere.
Yes, and Madam Chair, if I remember correctly, I think the distinction there is that the way the e-bike is defined specifically references the ability to pedal
Right.
the bike.
Right.
And so that's where, again, this kind of e-scooter kind of fits in this weird gray area of it doesn't have pedal power, it has push power. And that's why we've been kind of interpreting it more consistent with the skateboard. So.
Sorry, is the skateboard law a city law, or is that?
State.
That's a state law.
It's state. Yeah, and like I said earlier, I think it takes effect September 18th.
That's correct, the 18th, yeah.
Okay.
And if I recall it, I only looked at the summary of the legislation, but I think in the summary it mentioned that it permits operation of electric skateboards only on streets with speed limits of 25 miles an hour or below.
Correct.
So if we're being strictly interpreting the law, you can operate these things on 25 mile an hour streets and nowhere else, right?
Yeah.
Because given with the combination of the state and local law.
Yeah, we don't have any streets in town I know where are less than 25. So that would be the only thing you'd be operating on 25. The 35s and 45s and the few of those we do have, yeah, they'd have to stay off of those unless they're simply to cross it.
Right, yeah, and because the local ordinance technically prohibits them in the bike lanes and on sidewalks if they're motorized, right?
Yes.
And then technically that's the only place you're legally allowed to operate them, okay.
So we'll extend the time on this item a bit so that we have plenty of time to hear. What else do we have to say?
That's all I have at this moment, yeah.
I want to thank Scott and Raymond for speaking to this. I especially want to thank our first public speaker in bringing this up. It's really important. Thank you for coming out. When I first saw the city's initial response to this, I thought, you know what? Back in the 1970s, when these crazy bicycles started coming out again, city campuses and everybody went crazy. Where are we going to park these things? They're attached to handrails. This is here to stay, and we're just going to have to figure it out. And I think Scott is absolutely correct that it might not take this exact form, but it's going to be mobile and it's going to be not tethered into stations unless we force it to be. And I don't know if we should be forcing it to be. The other thing that I noted is that in the slideshow that was a preparation for a reminder what we talked about in June 2017, a city, I can't remember who the speaker was, but I do want to read the quote. Quote, this is about smart cities. It is important to remain adaptive to new technologies as they become available and tested. And yet, based on the Facebook response and newspapers that I've written, we have not been at all adaptive in terms of the city response. In fact, on Facebook, it was pretty much you cannot ride these anywhere, period. And in the newspapers, they were going to start issuing tickets. So I think we're going to have a long discussion about how to do this right, and I think there's other cities that are doing things that we need to follow. I'm more concerned about what's going to happen in the interim, where this gray area is. I'd say that it currently exists, because I don't know if these are actually vehicles at this point. I don't know how that gets classified. I don't know if they're motorized, because e-bikes are not motorized, according to the definitions that some of us use. So this is a gray area, and I encourage the city staff response to allow things to develop instead of react quickly. That's it.
Yes.
Can I make a comment from the university's perspective? Yeah, they showed up last Thursday night in the dark of night, and quite honestly, we were expecting it as well. Some of the differences here, because I agree with almost everything everyone's saying, I think we're supportive of different mobility options that make sense. We had many of these companies reach out to us previously, and we said, yes, we're supportive, we like the ideas, we need to get our infrastructure, our policies, safety protocols in place first. And many were respectful of that. This company was not. And to me, it's a little different because, you know, what's the difference of this company, a for-profit company, just coming with no approvals, no permits, and operating a business in city, university right away. And, you know, when you try to ask them to, hey, settle down, we want to get in front of this, it's too bad. We're just going to keep going. And so I think you're right. Everything you said, we need to work on those ideas and policies and figure this out. But it wasn't a very collaborative way that this came about. And that's the difficult thing. So, you know, we at the university has been saying the same things. If they're in ADA accessible areas, blocking sidewalks, left in the grass, we'll pick them up. Now, at this point, I checked today, I don't think we've actually, and our grounds folks have not picked any up at this point, I don't think, but we will if they're in the way. And there's been plenty of that want to work with us, and they want, and the ideas about the geofenced ideas, you know, they're looking into it, and they wanted to get back to us, but this company came along and just dropped them here. So I think that's a little different than being collaborative and working on it.
A few thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like in this very moment, the current crux of the issue is that they're ill-defined, right? So we're sort of in this limbo phase. But, you know, much like electric skateboards, I think they certainly should be allowed in bike lanes and on 25-mile-an-hour streets and below. However, you know, the overall regulation of these electric mobility devices, bicycles, et cetera, in high traffic and downtown sidewalks, I think is really important. But balancing that with areas outside of downtown where, as we've mentioned tonight, that mobility on those pathways is pretty acceptable and sometimes necessitated by lack of better infrastructure. So kind of the balancing act between how do you regulate, you know, what is a high traffic, high density shared sidewalk, and how do you regulate, you know, the balance of those two. And then kind of speaking to your last point about, you know, how do we interact with these companies? I think taxing these could be just a really, really key way to kind of create a check and balance with these companies who are, in essence, with that attitude, taking advantage of our community. They are saying we are sort of free and outside of regulation, free and outside of being beholden to sort of any type of regulation. And if anybody here in this community tries to sort of use those public spaces for profit, they are certainly going to be, you know, can't really think of the word, but they're going to be sort of beholden to those regulations, and to just dump that on the community, even though I agree with a lot of the things that this brings to the fore of mobility and whatnot, I just think it's bad behavior, and it's poor behavior, and it's a large corporate behavior, just sort of dropping this unwittingly on a community and forcing everybody to be on the back foot. So just some thoughts.
Yeah, and as you might expect, some of the other companies are now calling us back saying, hey, wait a second. So now we have that to kind of figure out as well. So for those that were trying to play by the rules, that, you know, what is their interpretation of the situation?
So I hand over here.
Yeah, I just had a question for Raymond. You mentioned that you had discussions with the Director of Mobility in Detroit regarding their plans. The few trips I've had to the city in the past month or so, the bird scooters have definitely been in the way of high traffic areas for pedestrians. Can you talk a little bit more about your conversations with him or her?
So it was Mark DeLaverne that I spoke with. Again, I got his title wrong. I think he's the Chief Mobility Officer out there. And one of the things in our discussions, and we've actually been talking about this for a couple months before these even came, and then I just saw him on yesterday morning. We discussed it a little bit further. Both he and I are kind of of the impression that the built environment in Detroit is a little different than the built environment in Ann Arbor. And so you have different constraints here that are maybe a little bit different than in Detroit. For example, if you look at sidewalk widths in our downtown versus the sidewalk widths in downtown Detroit, you have kind of different geometries and different operating spaces. And so, you know, in talking to Mark, and then the other thing to note too is they feel like, again, in speaking with Mark, he feels like there's a bigger gap in mobility opportunities in Detroit that they're trying to fill. You know, we have a pretty good transit system here. We have, you know, it's a much more compact area, and so while getting around is not always perfect, it's a little bit easier getting around here than around downtown Detroit. And so I think Detroit was more amenable to trying this pilot out kind of from the get-go and kind of learning as they go sort of approach, which, you know, I think that's the situation we're now finding ourselves in as well. And I think that's some of the distinctions between kind of the Detroit rollout and the Ann Arbor rollout. They are trying to work with the providers to deploy in areas, you know, I think Scott brought this up about deploying in areas where mobility needs are needed, you know, to either low-income populations or populations that aren't served by other forms of transportation. The other thing that I've talked to Mark about is providing an opportunity for people who don't have smartphones or credit cards, you know, the digital divide or the credit card divide, allowing opportunities for that population to use those scooters as well in Detroit. And so I think that's another possible consideration for us as well. So I think that's where some of our discussion has gone. I don't know if I directly answered your question, but that's kind of some of the things that we started to talk about a little bit. And you know, I reviewed the memo. They had kind of a memorandum of operation sort of thing and expectation that they released back in July, and I've looked that over. So again, we'll take cues from Detroit and others that we think are appropriate for Ann Arbor. And you know, again, I think this conversation is really helpful too for us, so then that way we can factor in what we're hearing from you.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, I
Yes.
have one more kind of discussion topic or question, and Scott, maybe you can help. We hear a lot about sustainability and you know, are these congestion mitigation help, you know, does it help with those things? And I have not found any data, and maybe you've seen something, because quite honestly, there's still an environmental impact, right? I mean, they still need to be charged with coal power typically, right? So granted, it's very small, but it's more than walking or riding a bicycle. And what I haven't been able to find is this really replacing a vehicle trip, or is this replacing a walking and a bicycle trip? And my sense and what I see is it's typical walking or bicycle trips. But I don't know. I think the public speaker talked a little bit about her daughter using it in kind of like the remote area of the downtown, which makes sense. I think that's probably a smaller portion of the trips that are used generally. But maybe you have some info.
Yeah, I haven't found, well, so, yes. One is in places where these, and dockless services, and not just scooters, but also bike services have been deployed heavily. Both the TNCs, like Uber and Lyft, have explicitly said that they've noticed a significant drop in the number of TNC rides. So I don't know if that doesn't say anything about private automobile trips, to the point where both Uber and Lyft are investing in these services and buying. I think Uber bought the dockless bike company, and Lyft is investing in them specifically because they see it's like eating into their business, and it is the business they're in. So I think that's a point in favor of it does have some impact on vehicle trips. And I actually lost this in my notes. I had an article that I didn't grab into my outline from China, which is a different place, so, caveats. But one place, like the number of like motor vehicle VMTs like dropped like 20% or something like that. And the number of trips by bike went up by like a similar amount. So it's like they're like in places where they're very heavily deployed. Obviously, Chinese cities are different than American cities, so it's harder to say that's going to be. But there is at least some evidence that it does. And even if every trip, even if it's replacing mostly bicycle and walking trips, if it's replacing a percentage of vehicle trips, that's still potentially a win. And also, from my perspective, generating more demand for infrastructure that isn't infrastructure for cars is also potentially a win, because if there's more people on these things and they want to operate them, and they want those protected bike lanes, and they want places to park those vehicles, as somebody who's a cyclist, like, great, they're my friend, because they're going to like encourage us to build more of that stuff, especially if there's money attached to it. So if taxes are part of the thing too, that's there. But yeah, it's early, so it's hard to say.
So can I direct the conversation a little bit to what would you like us to do? Should we study this further? Is this sufficient input for now for the city? What action are you interested in as a commission?
So can I say something about
Yeah.
that? So it seems to me there are two really separable issues. One is the issue of how we're going to regulate the companies and who we're going to allow to operate in the city. And the other is where can these scooters operate and where can they be parked? And it seems like those issues are quite urgent right now, given that they are in our community, both via Bird and also via private ownership. And I feel like the commission ought to have something to say about that.
Okay. Is that generally the sense?
The other thing I'd add is that Scott is clearly well-read on this topic. It would be a shame not for staff to have, if he's willing, him at the table to try to help figure this out. I mean, I think when we're working collaboratively with staff, it's when I think interesting things come together quickly. And so I'd encourage some form where Scott and potentially others are at the table.
You know that more than any of us, so. Well, we can draft a task force advisory committee kind of charter and have it ready for next time if you'd like, and be proactive and act on this before City Council asks us to, but rather provide some guidance to them if you'd like. Is that general sense that would be a good idea? And Scott would be a primary player, yes.
Yeah, I would definitely volunteer to serve on any task force or committee that's created to talk about this issue, yeah.
With that from Scott, I'd absolutely support that.
Any concerns? Oh, great. It's been a very productive discussion. I appreciate that.
Thank you all.
Thank you. All right, then we have a presentation by Kayla.
Yes. All right, so I'm going to share some information about the city's community engagement toolkit, and this is kind of a precursor to an item that's later on the agenda. We have the citizen input process for city street-related improvement projects, and Raymond's going to cover that a little later in the agenda, but that staff response to that council resolution that's being shared with you, it makes reference to the community engagement toolkit. So for you to get the most out of what this response is really saying, we think it's important to orient you to what resources that we are using when we, and what we mean when we refer to community engagement toolkit. So the city has a community engagement toolkit. This is the standard staff process that we use when we are starting a new project, policy, or program to figure out what our engagement strategy should be. Most, if not all, projects affect residents in our community, residents and other stakeholders, business owners, nonprofit organizations, special interest groups, and we want to make sure that there's an opportunity for those impacted to have a voice in the conversation and to include them in our projects at the right times and to the extent that that's feasible. So we want to provide open lines of communication, gather input from those that are affected by the outcome, and establish credibility and trust. Those are some of the reasons to do community engagement. There are lots more, but those are kind of a few high-level ones of why this is an important resource that the city has has prepared and makes available for staff. So the community engagement toolkit, exists on the city's intranet site, so you probably haven't seen it. I don't think we have an outward-facing website for it, at least not at this point. Perhaps in the future we may provide more information if the public is interested in that. But right now it's really an internal staff resource, and it works through some different pages. There are fillable forms on the intranet site where you answer questions about your project, and I'll share a little bit more in the following slides, but I just want to give you the overview of the full process. You would meet with your internal team, develop a community engagement action plan, identify your stakeholders, and then following your project after the engagement effort, analyze and record engagement outcomes. So that's the overview of our engagement process. So step one, preparing to meet with your internal team. So just as it's important that we are inclusive in who we reach out to when we're doing external facing community engagement, it's also important that internally we make sure across the organization that we've included the right people in the conversation. So you're probably aware that there are different units at the city. We do different things, but we need to be in conversation with each other. We need to make sure that we are aligned in what we are putting out to the community, so that non-motorized plan isn't saying one thing and then city master plan is saying something else, and that they need to be implemented consistently. And so it's important to look at across the organization who should have a voice in this and who should be included on the project team. Thinking also about who has expertise on the project area, who might support or oppose. You want to include all of those voices. So then you get started on developing, I'm going to say you, but I really mean us. Staff then get started on developing our community engagement action plan. So one of the first things that we want to think about is what is the level of impact of the project and how far reaching is it? So is it high impact or low impact? Is it citywide or local area? And this is one that is subjective, and you're not really going to get it right or wrong necessarily. There isn't necessarily right or wrong, but it's something that's worthwhile to think about, because it can help you as you develop the rest of your engagement strategy to kind of have in mind who is it that you're trying to reach and how interested do you think the community is going to be in the issue, though we don't always get that right. You received the staff response memo that Raymond's going to talk about later, and on the last page of that was an overview, the one-page overview of the engagement process, and that has a little more info about what we think about when we say high impact, low impact, citywide, local area. So feel free to reference that for more information. And also know we recognize that this could change throughout the project. As I said, we sometimes start a project thinking it only affects a small group, find out it affects a lot more, or think that it's of a lower interest, and actually it's higher. So then as we start working on our engagement action plan, there are various questions included in the toolkit that project teams work through. In these, I have found anytime I've worked through this list of questions with project teams that they learn something new about their project, something that they hadn't been thinking of. So I do, as one of the ambassadors of the Community Engagement Toolkit, encourage all of our staff to use this on projects, whether big or small. It's worthwhile to think about these questions and who's impacted and who might be interested. So are there divisive issues? Are there other efforts going on that might coincide or conflict with what you're doing? Are there communities that have done similar work, people we could reach out to if we need to do some benchmarking and get ideas, and we can learn from each other? Who is affected? What equity topics are impacted by this project? Who may have concerns? What does the community need? The time frame for completion and implementation, and also key questions that need to be addressed or answered through the community engagement process. So then as we start working on developing our community engagement action plan, there are many resources that are available to staff. So the example listing here are many ways where we can reach out, kind of communication tools of how we can get the word out to the public about a public meeting or an online survey, whatever our engagement strategy is. How can we promote that or share information with the community about a project? So meeting display cases at City Hall, you'll see the example image here is your calendar of meetings for the Transportation Commission. So that gets posted in the display case at City Hall so that general members of the public who might be interested, maybe some of the audience members here today might have seen a notice that this meeting was going to be taking place and they chose to attend. There's also the online calendar, hu.gov.org/calendar. That's where we post our public meetings electronically for people to find. Council and the city administrator communications is another way we get the word out to council members, and they send information to constituents in their wards. Press releases, the city website, there are often project pages where we'll post updates on particular projects. Email distribution, so through the city's Gov Delivery service, if you're familiar with that, that's a way that we stay connected and inform residents. It's an email subscription service where you can stay connected on topics you're interested in. Some smaller projects will also maintain like an email distribution list separate from Gov Delivery. If you come to a public meeting, you might put your name down on the sign-in sheet and then they'll keep you updated. Social media and also direct mailing and flyer distribution is sometimes used for project areas, often depending on the size of the project area and whether that's appropriate. Then also in developing our engagement action plan, we have a number of tools available in the format in which we engage. So it could be a public meeting, a focus group, advisory committee, community workshop, interviews. A2Open City Hall is the online survey system that the city uses for our online public forums. Board and commission meetings, so such as you've had presentations from many staff as they brought projects to the Transportation Commission to keep you all updated on topics you're interested in. Lecture and forum series, CTN, and also feedback forms are a tool that we use often at public meetings or other workshops. So often the engagement plan ends up including a mix of these tools, but this is just a sample of some ideas that we encourage staff to think about. So refining the stakeholder list, as we've talked so far about kind of how are we going to engage with people, what is the format, what are the tools we're going to use, but who are we going to engage with is a really important question. So who should be involved, what is their role, what is their purpose, and then inclusivity is a big one. We want to make sure that we are being equitable and inclusive in who we're reaching out to, and we're giving an opportunity for a broad range of perspectives to share feedback with us in different formats where people are comfortable. So I will share with you a sample of what our stakeholder list looks like. So the city has we've attempted to compile a comprehensive list of stakeholders, but I'll say comprehensive with air quotes because we know that we have not included everyone. We have tried to identify as many potential stakeholders as we're aware of, and our list is only as good as the information that we have. So if there are others that you know of, other organizations that should be represented, we'd like to know that. I'm going to scroll through and highlight some of the stakeholders included right now, and then I'm going to provide this list to you all electronically following the meeting, and it'll be posted in Legistar so that you can look at it more closely. You can follow up with me. So if anyone's listening at home and you also are aware of stakeholders, Coleman, Coleman @a2gov.org. You can email me information about stakeholders that should be included, and we'll make sure that staff are considering those other organizations. So we think about residential neighborhood groups. The city has a large list of residential groups across the city, and we look at which ones are applicable for projects in certain geographic areas. City units, so that's largely during the meet with your internal team step is when we would look at all the different city units and figure out who should be included. Boards and commissions, so you'll see the name of the commission, staff person that works with that commission, and then some information, the column here is about a description or what that audience is that we're trying to reach. So that's definitely not a comprehensive list of all of the city's commissions. I will say we have more than that, but these are the ones that I think are most often involved in our community engagement efforts. Agencies and public groups, quite a few of those, a number of different University of Michigan contact points, but I'm sure there's other that we could add there as well. Nonprofit organizations, environmental groups. I know I'm going fast, scrolling fast through these and you can't read them, but I just want to give you the snapshot. Ad hoc organizations, so this is something we think about in a particular project area. This most often will evolve with the project. Sometimes there isn't a standing organization, but as a large project comes through a neighborhood, citizens might band together and create. So an example I would say is Safety on 7th, Save Our Streets. They created a group of citizens, an ad hoc organization. To my knowledge, I don't know that they're an official nonprofit organization, so we don't have them in that category, but we still want to make sure that we are reaching out to them as a stakeholder on projects that we think they'd be interested in. Also business organizations and commercial neighborhoods. And limited English proficiency audiences. This came to us from AATA. That list is shorter than I think it should be longer, but again, we need to know what are the organizations we should be reaching out to. A large focus that the city's been looking at is our equity focus and wanting to make sure that we are reaching all of the audiences. So for example, if non-English speaking audiences are not getting our communication because we're sending them all out in English, we need to be working on that and figuring out how it can evolve and be more equitable in what we're providing. So we welcome your feedback and any organizations you know about to help with that. So back to this. All right, so that's stakeholders. And then of course you execute your community engagement strategy. You've thought about what are all the right tools, what are all my communication strategies, who do I include, do all of your public engagement, and then come back to analyze and record engagement outcomes. We want to learn from what we did, what was effective, what worked well, what didn't work well, what were the participation rates, what impact did the stakeholders have, what did we learn. So that is our engagement process. If you have any questions now, I'm happy to answer those, or if you'd like to let Raymond talk more about how this relates to transportation projects, and then I can answer questions then as well. Yes, Scott.
This is a topic on my mind. We had our work session with Planning Commission yesterday reviewing some of our public engagement tools. It strikes me that sort of one of the sort of similarities between big transportation projects and large site plans in neighborhoods is there's a often contentious, often sort of complicated process, and people find it difficult to orient themselves and difficult to find out about. And I think one of the things we talked about yesterday was getting better at sort of giving people, when we're notifying people about things that are about to happen, helping orient people to what the process is, what to expect of the process and how they can participate. And I'm sure we do a lot of that, but that's something we think we can do better at in terms of what's coming, what's the process look like, what are the opportunities for input. And that's different depending on the nature of the project, but being as clear as we can about that and making it as easy as possible for people to get oriented. And for specific things that once there's sort of an identified project that has bounds, making one of our wish list items is a better sort of single place we can point people to that has an ongoing set of updates. And we do that for certain kinds of projects. And some of the challenges are limitations with the software the city's working with and all of that. But it'd be nice if there's one place to point people to, or if they wanted to get notified, they could sign up. So if there's something going on 7th, you just go to that webpage and it has whatever's happening, what to expect next, and where to get notified when something changes or is going on. So I don't know if there's any, I'm sure you talk to planning people a lot, but any kind of strategies we can use that are similar to kind of continue to improve that would be useful.
Yeah, no, that's great feedback. I think we want to establish that kind of consistency across the organization, and so I would be happy to reach out to planning and see what we can do to make that happen.
I have a question, which it just seems to me like a large gaping hole in this, unless it's filled someplace else, is previous reports, commissions, advisory committees, and that kind of thing. It seems like they should carry a great deal of weight as far as the public engagement process, and just because it happened 1 year ago or 5 years ago doesn't mean that it should be dismissed. And I think particularly those types of groups have an opportunity to learn more about the process, and also some of the, oh, that's why you do it that way, where some of the, and that's an important contribution. It's great to have people come in and respond immediately, but oftentimes it isn't quite as informed. So I think balancing those two things is important, but also all those studies and things that we invest so much money in, that is extremely valuable public participation. And I don't see where that is plugged into this process.
I think some of that comes out in I had the list of questions that we think about when we're working on our engagement strategy. Related projects, I think, was one, what conflicts or coincides with this. I think that's where a lot of that will come up, is if we know maybe something that has happened in the past or that's upcoming. And so that may not have been clear, but those are both considered. But
I think it deserves a lot of weight.
Yeah, and Madam Chair, if I may, one of the things that we've kind of realized recently is a lot of times staff has taken cues from some of those past planning practices, whether it's the non-motorized plan or whatever the case may be, but there may be a lag of time from when that document was developed from when it gets implemented. And so one of the things that we've talked a little about internally, but we haven't solved for yet, so I can't give you our magic bullet yet, but is how can we kind of refresh the conversation and let people know that, remember we talked about this 2 years ago, 3 years ago, hey, good news, we're implementing it starting next week, and this is why, and kind of really explaining the why before we actually go out and implement.
Yeah.
Because there have been some changes recently to the roadway that we could have maybe done a better job communicating as to why those changes were made. They weren't done in a vacuum. They were actually community discussions that happened previously, but it behooves us to kind of refresh that messaging for everyone so that they understand why we're doing what we're doing. And I think that's part of the conversation that we're trying to figure out as well, what the best mechanisms are to do that.
Any other questions or comments before we ask Raymond to apply this? Thank you, Kayla.
Thank you.
I think the city really does care about public participation and reaches out pretty well.
Thank you.
Okay, Raymond, you're on.
All right, thank you, Madam Chair. So on July 2nd, 2018, City Council passed a resolution, and you have this backup that I'm going to be referencing in your packet. And it ultimately had 3 directives to staff. The first was to implement a process that ensures upfront neighborhood input is obtained and notification is provided prior to implementation of any permanent street improvement. The second was that the city administrator report back to council after consultation with the Transportation Commission on the citizen engagement process selected and how and when it will be implemented. And then the last one was that in conjunction with any proposed lane reduction proposal, city staff shall provide council with current traffic volume data, including peak hour volumes and volume to capacity ratios, as well as projections for safety improvements and traffic delays. So, I think I touched on some of, not trying to surmise exactly what this is a result of, but, I think there were some projects recently where there was a lot of question as to the why a project happened. And I think this is an attempt to help fill that gap and to ensure that we are following a community engagement process. One of the things that we did on our part is we kind of went through and we said, we don't want to apply a one-size-fits-all approach because, a region-wide project or study may require something different than a small project that may just affect a couple of property owners. And so what we tried to do is go through and kind of tease out the differences between each of those, so then that way we could kind of set some expectations with council as well as the community in terms of the extent to which public engagement would be implemented at kind of at a minimum. And Kayla, the process that Kayla just highlighted is really the foundation that we'll use to advance that. So I'll just quickly kind of run through those. Again, these are in your backup, but I'll just run through them so that you can kind of have an appreciation for what the engagement would entail. So routine street repair, maintenance, and resurfacing per the council resolution is excluded. This would be no change to the existing roadway. It's just maintenance, for lack of a better term. And so there's no engagement necessary as part of that. However, a street reconstruction project that's a much bigger scale may result in reconfiguration, may be a longer duration in terms of implementation. We would implement the community engagement toolkit that Kayla just highlighted. Similarly, utility replacement projects, because they often tear up the roadway in a similar function as a complete road restoration or reconstruction, we would again deploy the community engagement toolkit. Traffic calming, I believe all of you are familiar with the fact that traffic calming has its own kind of process for engagement. It's very focused at the neighborhood level, and there are several kind of points of contact with the neighborhood throughout the entire process. And so that process is really well defined, and we'll continue to use that for traffic calming projects. For lane reduction projects or road diets, the idea here is that we would analyze conditions to verify that the proposed reduction would provide an appropriate level of service for all users. Per council's direction, we would report that back in the form of traffic volume data, including peak hour volumes, volume to capacity ratios, as well as any projection on safety and other improvements. We would use the community engagement toolkit on this as well. Again, these tend to be bigger, longer projects that may affect, parts of the community, either quadrants of the community or the community as a whole, and so we would deploy the community engagement toolkit on that as well. Sidewalk gaps are kind of a nuance between different types of sidewalk gaps. So we identified typically 3 different types of sidewalk gaps. They could either be part of a larger capital project, they could be a standalone sidewalk gap project, or they could be through a private development. And so what we pretty much said is those first 2, we would use the community engagement toolkit. So if it's a sidewalk gap or part of another major project, the community engagement toolkit would be kicked in. The other thing to note is that construction and new sidewalks are typically paid for through a special assessment, and there is an established process for that. So it has to go through 4 progressive council resolutions, 1 formal public hearing, and 1 administrative hearing. So there's kind of, if you're going to end up taxing people for, an improvement, you have to go through an additional process as part of that as well. For major crosswalk improvements, so we're talking about things like the rectangular rapid flashing beacons or any of the gateway treatments. community input is not planned for these crosswalk treatments because these typically are implementation of other factors, of other plans that have been identified. And so we've gotten direction either from partners, from the community, or through a planning process. And so these are really just to highlight existing infrastructure that's there. So we're not necessarily doing any additional public input on those. For sidewalk ramps, pedestrian islands, and curb bump outs, the impacts of these types of projects are mostly limited to the adjacent property owners. And in the future, staff will reach out to the property owners and provide them with an opportunity to give us their feedback before those are implemented. So that concludes kind of the overview of, when we sat down, we brainstormed in terms of all the different types of projects that we're currently doing and what we thought was the most appropriate form of public engagement on it. Again, Kayla had referenced the community engagement process one-page overview that was attached to this memo as well. It kind of gives you the high-level framework of how we would apply this. There is a lot more that goes on the back end. I can tell you when you fill this out, it's a multi-step process. So that's what we're thinking. We wanted to consult with you per council's direction first before we forwarded this on to council as our response to the resolution that they passed back in July.
Any comments or questions? Yes.
Can I just ask about the Maple Road lane reduction? Because I've heard a lot of complaints from residents about not getting consulted ahead of time and then being asked for input after the fact. And also the absence of a crosswalk.
Yeah, so there are a couple, great question, Commissioner, thank you for bringing that up. So this is a great example of the non-motorized plan had identified a facility on Maple that we wanted to figure out a way to implement. And so that road was up for resurfacing, as I understand it. And I don't know if it was a reconstruction or resurfacing, but and we thought, well, now's the opportunity to figure out how we can implement what's identified in the non-motorized plan. And we went through, we looked at the data, and the data suggested that that segment of roadway could operate and at acceptable levels of service if we did a road diet or lane reduction. The other thing to note about road diets in general is road diets are considered a proven safety countermeasure by Federal Highway Administration. The idea here is that when you have 4 lanes, 2 lanes going in each direction, you have several different safety concerns that are generated as a result of that. In particular, when cars are stopped in the left lane to make a left-hand turn into either a driveway or into a business, what happens is you will often have either rear-end collisions in that left lane, or you'll have side-swipe collisions as the car that's behind the car that's stopped all of a sudden tries to swerve over, and might side-swipe another vehicle. And so the reason why a 3-lane configuration, 1 lane in each direction with a center turn lane, is not only a proven safety countermeasure, but operationally suggests it would perform just as well, is you have 2 through lanes that in theory are going to operate pretty consistently. It's not going to have a lot of stop traffic in it. You're not going to have that left turning car moving over and stopping traffic. And so as a result, traffic should flow much more predictably and much more safely. The added benefit of doing that road diet then also gives us added space to put a buffer in for the bike lane, which is what we were able to do as part of that project. So this is a good example of, we had taken a cue from a plan from a couple years ago, and we maybe didn't do a very good job of communicating the implementation of that before it went out. And so that's one of the reasons why I think that project in particular, I think, is one of the reasons that spurred this resolution, and one of the things that we kind of learned our lesson from and want to move forward with. And so one of the things, too, to note on 7th Street, and I think we've reported this in our past monthly updates, we're continuing to monitor how well that's working. There's always an adjustment period. We know that change is hard, and it's different than what was out there before. And so we expect there to be some growing pains, as those adjustments come into place. But the hope is that over time, things begin to normalize and people, factor in what that new road configuration looks like. So we are monitoring it. I can tell you I was working the football game on Saturday with my streets and signals crew, and I was out there, I kept saying, what's happening on Maple? What's happening on Maple? Is this any worse than what a typical game day would be? Because obviously game day is kind of a unique situation. All the roads are fairly congested. So we are continuing to monitor it. We're also looking at the safety data along there. And then we'll kind of figure out what the next step is if we, make it official, because right now the paint that's out there now is just paint. It's not thermoplastic. And so there, if there are reconfigurations that are warranted next construction cycle, next summer, we can make those modifications then.
Any other questions or comments? Yeah.
Thanks, guys. Two things come up, and I don't know if they involve discussion here. I'll save the 7 stuff for later for the project updates, along with a thank you for that. One is that I noticed in the resolution from City Council there was a lot of discussion around schools, school zones, Ann Arbor Public Schools initiated projects, and it was one of the things that the traffic calming task force mentioned is bridging that better. And I feel like I'm still in the dark as to what's happening with the school. So I don't know if this is the place to bring it up, but since the resolution explicitly brought it to the forefront, I don't know what's going on there. And then the other thing, I know that City Council only wants peak hour data and that kind of stuff. Could you send them the non-peak hour data? Like how many vulnerable users want to use this, what the 85th percentile speeds are, what it means if there's a collision that occurs. I live on Packard near Platt, and I can tell you that 20 minutes out of the day, yes, there is horrible traffic. But the other 23 hours and 45 minutes, it is brutal to bike or walk on. We're going to have to make some decisions, and I wouldn't mind that data going to City Council as well. I know it wasn't asked for, but I'll say that.
So we want to stick more to the process than the content at this point, but.
Yeah, and admittedly, we haven't really come up, we've toyed around with a couple templates in terms of how to address that last point, and we're still kind of toying around with what that would look like. So, any suggestions are welcome, so thank you for that.
Other comments about that process? Great, then thank you for that, and then we'll get into the, so I guess we don't have your presentation quite yet. We have one thing in between. Is that right? Okay, yes, now we're talking about new member. Unfortunately, Councilmember Ackerman's not here to help us out with this, but Kayla has a little bit of an update on it first, and then a question to the commission.
So Linda Diane raised this, the opportunity that the Transportation Commission may be interested in providing some information to better orient new council members that are coming in. And so I've followed up with staff, and there is a council member orientation that takes place late November. I don't remember the dates exactly, but it's been scheduled and the agenda is set, and there is an opportunity that a slide about the Transportation Commission can be added to the materials that the new commissioners will see, so that will explain the role of the commission and highlight at a high level what the commission does. And also that if the commission would like to prepare written communications about the functions of or accomplishments of the commission, if you want to give a history on what the commission's done, whatever it is, the information that you want to share to council members, that could be provided to all council members as a written report. However, there isn't really opportunity to schedule, at least as I've been told, as we've discussions so far have identified that there's really not opportunity to schedule time with council members for the Transportation Commission. Part of that is the number of commissions that exist, and allowing time for each commission with council would become unwieldy. Also that agenda is set. As I've said, they've already scheduled the time for that orientation. So at this point, I think it's worthwhile to still discuss what information you'd like to share with City Council. And it also is worth talking about if this could be your annual report, which we've mentioned before at a previous meeting, that the ordinance that establishes the Transportation Commission references this report that's to be provided, and we haven't yet prepared one, and we're a little over a year old, so it may be about time. And I think that that could be a benefit for all council members, not just the new ones coming in, but to hear what has the commission been working on, what topics are you interested in discussing in the future, things of that sort, perhaps. But I would, of course, defer to the commission on what you choose to pass along. So that's what I have.
And how are those annual reports usually generated? I mean, do you do all that work and run it by us, or what, is there a normal process?
I can follow up with other commissions and see if there's a standard process. There isn't a standard process that I'm aware of. All I have to go off of is the ordinance language that says the commission will provide a report to council. So I would encourage you all to at least be thinking of what would you like to see in that report, an outline of what information it is that you're interested in sharing with council. I'm happy to do follow-up and see whether or not that, if other commissions are doing annual reports, if the meat of it is written by the staff liaison, or if it's written by a volunteer from the commission. I don't know if Scott, you're on another commission, and Tim as well. I don't know if either of you know whether, or if I've missed anyone else that's a liaison for another commission, speak up if you have examples of any experience with other annual reports.
Yeah, the Planning Commission does not provide any sort of report.
Okay. Tim, do you know?
Yeah, I don't know of anything.
No? Okay. I will follow up and see. It may...
Well, actually, I think we do an annual report. Yeah, like, there might be something.
Okay.
It's just like a report of things they've done. Now that I think about it, it was a while ago, just.
Okay.
So I guess my suggestion would be that as commissioners, we forward to Kayla information on what we'd like to see and what we think is important to include in that report. Some of the things that you are most proud of that we've done. That's what annual reports are about. I absolutely think that we should include a slide in that orientation. We've got 2 months to come up with one slide. That should work. Some of the background information, which I think is kind of obvious as far as our reports to City Council that the new members would not have. But anything else that you think is important. And I personally don't take no as an answer, so I think we can still invite City Council people to attend a meeting that we set up, and I would ask our City Council representative for help in figuring out how to go about that as well. And we don't know if Zachary will continue with us or if they're going to change that again. So once we know that, so that would be my suggestion, is that we do those things. But I think it's important to let them know that we exist and what our function is and how functional we are as well. And of course, we represent a variety of wards, and we can also personally let our council people know that we're sitting on this commission and that they can be in contact with us as constituents. Does that work, Kayla?
Yep, that works.
So you and I will do a lot of work.
Yes. I don't know, I'll send out maybe an email with a deadline or something of when you can send me
That'd be great.
information. I don't have one off the top of my head. But if you can just be thinking about what you would like to see in that report, and we'll go from there.
Great. So then I would ask Raymond to take the floor again and to go over some of the highlights of the updates.
All right. Thank you, Madam Chair. Again, I'm going to go over the transportation project updates. It's available in your backup and online. The first thing I want to note, there is a note at the very top of the report that notes that there was a labor dispute that started on September 4th. I just got an email today indicating that that is still ongoing, that there's a lockout between the Michigan Infrastructure and Transportation Association and the operating engineers. And so as a result, a lot of the heavy equipment operators which would be, laying asphalt, things like that, are in a lockout. And so that is having some effects on some of the projects. And right now, there's no indication in terms of when that lockout is going to, or when that labor dispute is going to be resolved. So that is going to have bearing on some of these timelines, and there's a big kind of footnote on anything in the report that right now this is the projection, but obviously if the lockout goes longer, that may have bearing on being able to finalize and open up the project. Okay, so that being said, I'll just jump through to some of the changes from last month. First, I'll note 7th Street improvements. One of the things that I will bring to your attention is we did some reconfiguration at 7th Street as you approach Stadium. In particular, there was removal of a right turn lane, and removal of that right turn lane allowed for the buffer for the bike lane to be carried all the way up to the intersection. That has led to some concerns from residents that we've heard from, quite a few of. One of the issues is that a lot of motorists are continuing to kind of use that space as a right turn lane. They're using kind of the buffer in the bike lane to make that right-hand turn, which is creating a conflict not only with people in the bike lane, but also with the straight through right turn lane. So those who are going to be making the turn legally from where they're supposed to are now being blocked from doing that by people who are coming up on their right side. So we are aware of this. We're trying to figure out kind of the best solution in terms of how to move it forward. And one of the things that we were hoping to deploy was, we determined maybe wasn't the best fit, but we're looking to put up some sort of delineator or something in that buffer that would discourage that behavior from happening. There's been a lot of call for us to restore that right turn lane. And the one thing that I want to just state is that we want to give traffic an opportunity to normalize out here. It's language that I mentioned earlier when we talked about Maple. And this intersection is particularly constrained right now because of what's happening on Scioto Church as well as what's happening on Pauline. That the northbound movement, anyone coming off of Scioto Church not everyone, but a lot of that traffic is being pushed north onto 7th if they want to come into town. And so there's probably more traffic going through that intersection northbound than would typically be the case. Those that might otherwise be using Main or head out east, right now they're forced to head west and up north, 7th. Then similarly, a lot of the eastbound traffic, eastbound traffic that may have diverted at Pauline is coming through that intersection as well. So you just have a lot more pressure on that intersection than you would normally have. And so it's hard for us to discern exactly how much of the constraint at that intersection is a result of this new lane configuration versus how much is a result of some of this other work that's happening. And so we're kind of waiting for that other work to finish up and then really start to analyze how well it's performing. We did model it, we did analyze it before we did that, and all indications were that it should perform adequately. And so it's just one of those things that, I implore everyone to use patience, maybe factor in a little bit of extra travel time when going through that intersection, and that we will be working on some solutions to kind of hopefully get people to behave in a way that it was intended at that intersection. And just if everyone follows the rules of the road, we really want to make sure people are safe. And so there's some activities and motions out there that are happening that we're a little concerned of and we want to try to address. So that is on our radar for South 7th. The other part is North 7th. So we did mail postcard flyers to all of the adjacent properties on North 7th Street. This is the segment between Miller and Huron. Again, this was the idea of implementing the non-motorized plan. May require the removal of parking on that segment of 7th Street in order to accommodate bike lanes. So we sent out a postcard. Those were due back just this week, and so we're still compiling those results to figure out where we go from here. I'll have more of a status update on that North 7th segment at your next meeting. Let's see. Did want to jump several pages back to the Ann Arbor Station. The archaeological investigation at Fuller Road is complete, And my understanding is there were no significant findings of archaeological resources at that site, so there's nothing that would kind of prohibit that site or any special considerations in result of that archaeological investigation. And those will be wrapped into the environmental process when that process moves forward. We're continuing to work on that. There is just a little one-liner that was added about the traffic calming. We brought that to this commission last meeting. Soon after that last meeting of the Transportation Commission, we uploaded that into Legistar, and so that's expected to go to City Council on October 1st. Traffic calming program, the Blewett Drive traffic calming program, that was a fairly long process. The Survey 10 responses received did not allow that process to move forward. And so right now, no further action will be taken on Blewett. And then just as a heads up, ones that are in queue, Scioto Church, we just had a meeting the other day to talk about how to move that process forward. And so Scioto Church looks like it'll be the next program coming up through the traffic calming program.
Scioto Church Service Drive.
I'm sorry, yes, Scioto Church Service. Kayla. Quiet zone train horn noise study. The big thing to pay attention to here is we're anticipating a public comment period and public meeting scheduled for October 3rd. That's the date that the consultant will be in town gathering data, and so they'll be here and collecting public comment as well. We'll be sure as soon as we solidify the date, time, and location, we'll send that out to this commission as well. And then the last thing I wanted to highlight was towards the bottom, there's a crosswalk streetlight implementation. We actually reported to you on this last time when we talked about crosswalks, but I thought it was germane enough to make its way into this report as well. And so then that way I'll start kind of updating that information here. But the information that you have in this month's report is very similar to what was in last month's on the crosswalk update. So those are the kind of substantive changes I wanted to highlight, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Any questions or comments?
So I just had a question, something not on here that I'm curious about. As I noticed today, there are bollards installed in the buffer on Ashley, in the bike lane buffer on Ashley just before Huron, which I appreciate, and I had no idea that was coming, and I'm curious how that happened, and if you know.
Yeah, so we're playing around with different kinds of treatments, especially those that can either withstand winter maintenance when we're putting snowplows out, or can be easily removed and not damage the roadway when winter maintenance happens. And so we found a type of bollard that we experimented with, I believe, on Ashley, and we're trying to see how well those work. And so again, this is always kind of a learning process for us. Sometimes we put things out, we think it'll work great, and then it turns out that there was something that we didn't account for that kind of changes our mind. And so, yeah, Ashley is one of those instances where we're deploying kind of a new thing. And what's nice about it is this technically changes a buffered bike lane into a protected bike lane, right? So now you have an actual vertical element with separation from the motor vehicles and the bike lane itself. So it's something we're looking at.
Yeah, cool. I was surprised to see it. So yeah, it's a very short protected bike lane, but at least there's something, right?
Albeit.
I just wanted to
start somewhere, right?
Yeah, I'll just acknowledge the assist. Thanks for the update on MDOT in North Main. That's what I'm following, and I'm hoping I can insert myself into meetings. I live right there, so I have very, very specific and deep interest on what happens there. And I think it's a big opportunity, and I hope we can get MDOT to come along with the city on that. So.
Yeah, thanks for the patience with 7th. I'll be curious once the construction's done. I also noticed that rolled out pretty much when school started. So I think that, there's just a little bit of extra stress going on. That said, I have bicycled the corridor numerous times, and I feel more confident and more comfortable. And I feel like cars are going slower. I'd be curious to see if that's true with data, but at least in those stretches, it's working. And thank you for that. I think that it's a big step forward If we have to move backward, then maybe we could do something like Stadium in Maine, where it's a shared lane that's obvious, right? If we want to bring that back in. Which also leads me to the comment that, thank you for recognizing that a lot of the buffered lane conflicts are really an education and enforcement issue, not necessarily how the street is engineered itself. And I'm wondering if, that Stadium right-hand turn has the green boxes to indicate this is a conflict zone, or this is where bicycles, should go. I'm wondering if there's any thoughts about incorporating some of that into the area, and instead of like share the road, it could be yield to bikes, anything that can signal to drivers, this is how to use this space, that doesn't have to be like a video or a pamphlet or something.
Right, yeah, no, point well taken. We actually have discussed that. Because the buffer is fairly substantial, it's wider than a lot of our other buffers, really trying to minimize that right hook phenomenon that you're familiar with, that where right-turning vehicles cross the path of straight-moving bicycles. And what's the best way to do that? Is it signage? Is it pavement marking? Is it enforcement? Is it education? Maybe all the above. We've toyed around with a couple concepts on paper, and we're kind of taking it step by step to see which is getting us the behavior that we would expect out there. So one of the first things we're looking at is some sort of, vertical delineator to kind of keep vehicles out of the bike lane. We think that would be a positive first step. And then from there, we'll see if other actions need to be taken as well. So point well taken, though.
I have a question about the Allen Creek berm. We've sort of heard the same thing every month for quite a while. Is there a potential problem with the easements, or what's happening with that?
Yeah, and my understanding is it was really just a question of trying to get it in the right fiscal year with the right, funding, and because my understanding is it's dependent upon, some federal funding and what have you. And so my understanding, and I can check with Eli Cooper, who's project manager on that, that we fully anticipate that things are going to move forward spring of next year, but we weren't able to kind of line things up to get it in kind of process this fall. And so right now there's no indication that timeline for next spring for getting that project going again. Why there's no reason, we don't anticipate that there to be any problem with that. So it pushed back further than we had hoped because we couldn't get the project we can line all our ducks up for fall implementation, and so it got pushed to spring.
But someone's actively working on the easements right now?
Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions or comments? Great, thank you very much for that. And we'll move right into liaison reports, I believe, as the next item. My agenda's disappeared. Are there any liaison reports from anyone who, yes?
So earlier in the discussion, Commissioner Trudeau was talking about bird scooters or scooters in general, and you had mentioned bike share. So I just wanted to respond. I was on part of the community partners, the university, the DDA, AAATA, and the city, to work on a new operator for the bike share program. And we went through the RFP process and selected one, and it's the same provider as in Detroit, Shift. So they're trying to get up and going, and they'll be operating the existing network that's here now, and hopefully expanding in the future. Trying to get it up and going this fall. Remains to be seen if that'll happen. It might be paused for the rest of this year, but it will be up and going again. So I just wanted to bring that up.
Any other liaison reports? And communications from commissioners, individuals? All right, then we can talk about next agenda items. Any additions to the work plan that we have?
I don't know if it goes without saying, but just continual updates on the e-scooter issue and active what is the,
Okay, we'll have a
Shared active transportation or micromobility, yeah.
I mean, I don't know if we could put them into the road updates. That doesn't seem to quite make sense, but I think this is going to be an ongoing discussion
okay.
that I'd like to
So an
have.
update as well as an action item.
Yeah.
Okay.
And following up on Brad's comment about feeling in the dark about the school improvements, maybe we could have a specific report about that.
Is that on the agenda coming up in the next couple months already, or?
No, there isn't an item about the schools. So, are you specifically talking about a particular school improvement related project or a general I felt like I heard a couple of different things tonight about general APS coordination with the city. Is that the topic, or is it specific project related?
I was thinking of an overview type report. Were you thinking of something different?
I guess on a couple of fronts, really. One is how are we going to better work together, city and schools, but also that I've just been surprised, like the Blewett School initiative, like I had no idea that was going on, and it sounds like the city also maybe didn't. I'm just curious what's on their radar, what are they thinking about? You know, Tier 3, I believe, on the school safety zones is currently rolling out, and Tier 4 is starting to gain traction. I'd be curious what's going on at Northside Steam. You know, we get updates all the time, but I don't actually know what they're considering.
So Liz Margolis may be able to.
Yep, I'll reach out.
Help us out with that. Hopefully she can come to a meeting.
Yeah.
I know that people are also anxious to hear how the Fuller Road crosswalk thing turned out once you integrated the feedback from May 29th.
Okay. So back. Any other agenda items?
So I have, we're anticipating that 7th Street will be ready for possibly an action item, if there is an action to be taken related to, we did I think we have updated already that we did the mailing to the residents along the street in addition to the broader community outreach, and that deadline for when those responses, I think that deadline has passed since we're compiling final results and may know about North 7th by the October meeting, so we're anticipating that as an agenda item. Bike share, as Commissioner Dolan mentioned, maybe that's when we had tagged for a potential presentation to the commission and got bumped out a couple times because we hadn't yet identified the provider. So I've got those two, and then e-scooters, and I think we'll come back to the whole annual report discussion and school improvements. So we've got a lot, and Linda, Diane, and I will work on figuring out logistically how we fit all these in, but we have a full agenda coming up.
Good. So the next meeting is October 17th, and it will be here on the second floor of the City Council chambers. And Kayla and I do agenda setting usually the first Friday of each month. So if you have additional items or concerns, let us know by then or before then. Is there any other business? So if there's no objections, then I'll adjourn the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm curious to hear about that.